Welcome back to the channel. Today's lesson is titled Babe Ruth and the New Paradigm Swing. So we're reaching the end of our topspin forehand series, and I want to say welcome to all the people that have joined us in the last month or so, month or 2 months. A lot of you have expressed your gratitude about the series. I appreciate that very much. Others have said, I think I've had enough of the forehand. I want to get on to the other strokes, and I understand that as well. I just want to explain that I started with the forehand because that's where I thought I had the most knowledge and skill to convey these concepts to you. And I'm out there practicing every day the same things I'm telling you, and I'm learning new things, and these lessons sort of emerge from that practice. It's not something I have in my desk and I can pull out and say, here's the backhand series or here's the serve series. I have to do it myself, just like I'm recommending that you do it. But this lesson will encapsulate sort of the higher level principles that we've been evolving and give you a sense of where we're going for the other strokes. And you'll see that eventually that the same understandings and principles and feels that we work through in the topspin forehand will apply to the other strokes, and that gives you a sense of kind of the lessons that you'll be getting in the future. I think they'll be quite a bit shorter because we've covered these principles quite well, but we're going to be going somewhat in the similar vein, and my purpose is to give you the new paradigm I think is in swinging on the topspin forehand, and give you that paradigm in the backhand and the serve. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as this lesson goes on, but I wanted to give you that quick overview. The model for the topspin forehand that I've been teaching you since May, really, is what I call the kinetic whip model. I believe that it is a new paradigm, and that paradigm came into being really with Roger Federer winning the 2003 Wimbledon. And for the next 20 years, the big three have dominated the sport with this new paradigm swing. And we'll talk more in detail about that. But as I was thinking about presenting this lesson, I was thinking, well, what would be equivalent to the incredible dominance that the big three took over in one generation, where they won 82% of the Grand Slams in over 20 years. And I thought about Babe Ruth and what I knew a little bit about Babe Ruth, and I have a personal connection with this analogy because my father grew up watching Babe Ruth in New York City. And I asked him, what was it like seeing him play? What was it like seeing him hit? And he, Babe Ruth was a god to him, as he was to many people. And he said, there was no one even close to what Babe Ruth was doing when he was swinging. The sound of his bat, the speed, the power was completely transformational, revolutionary at the time. And that's sort of the magnitude of the paradigm shift that we're talking about in the tennis swing. So in the background here, you see some of the stats on Ruth. He didn't just change the game or change the swing, he revolutionized it. Prior to Ruth, the lifetime home run record was 131 home runs for a player playing his entire lifetime. Ruth established his record at 714, which is more than 5 times the previous players of earlier generations. And it wasn't just because the older players played with a dead ball, and people who know about these things will say that sort of thing. But Ruth hit 59 home runs in 1921. This was the equivalent of entire teams for the entire season with a 25-man roster hitting 59 home runs. That was the average for the entire team. So Ruth was 25 times, in terms of home run power, more powerful than the average player at that time. So this lesson is about the revolutionary paradigm that the big three brought into play with beginning in the 2003 to 2023. There were 80 Grand Slams played in that 20 years. And the big three won 82% of those 80 Grand Slams in those 20 years. This was something that's never really happened. And people will speculate all kinds of different reasons for why that. Well, suddenly this new generation bloomed good athletes better than the previous, but I don't really buy that. Sampras and other people were equally as good. The real difference, I think, came in their ground stroke technique, where they could hit with such power and spin. And people will dispute that, and that's fine. I would say that Federer obviously had a good serve, and that equates to some superiority. But Nadal and Djokovic, you remember, at the beginning of their careers did not have good serves or strong serves or net games or volleys. You remember Nadal won his first US Open in 2010. Well, in his early career when he was playing the US Open, his average first serve speed was only 100 miles an hour, way down there. And you all will recall how Djokovic in his early days was totally lacking confidence in his serve, and he used to stand there on the baseline and bounce the ball 21 times or so before he would serve. It was a wreck, and eventually he fixed it, and so did Nadal. So the real reason I think that differentiates these players was their ground stroke technique on the forehand and backhand side, and we've been featuring the forehand side of that equation throughout this series, and you've seen many slow motion analysis videos of the big three. So this lesson summarizes a lot of the past lessons and a lot of the feels and principles that we've built up into a higher level understanding and skill level for our topspin forehand. But in this lesson, there are some new things and new techniques that I want you to be aware of and practice. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get started. Just stepping back again to the older generation versus this big three generation, and what was the difference in how much they achieved to prior generations. It wasn't really the serve. You know, again, Federer had a good serve, but it wasn't as good a serve as Pete Sampras or many other, Pancho Gonzalez or other earlier generation players. So the serve hasn't changed that dramatically in tennis over the last 40 or 50 years. Yes, there's some improvements along the way, for sure. And certainly volleying, and that hasn't really improved that much. But the ground strokes, topspin, forehand, and backhand, that's the paradigm shift. And so the goal and mission of Go Tennis is to try to bring you an explanation and how to learn this new paradigm, topspin, forehand, and then backhand, and to explain the principles and feels that go along with that. And just to summarize what that paradigm shift swing looks like, you know, it is this kinetic whip. The kinetic part of the title stands for the kinetic chain, using all of the kinetic chain of the entire body to lead and power the shot, as opposed to the old paradigm, which we'll go into and said many times, is a arm-driven, arm-led kind of swing. So half of the equation is using the body instead of the arm, leading with the body instead of the arm. But the other part of this new model is really the accent on the whip component of the swing. This blazing release of energy from the rotating body up and around, you know, at a speed that's 4 or 5 times faster than the old generation, and with more consistency. In the background here of the slide, I've sort of captured this little chart evolution of where I think the swing has evolved to over time in tennis and in earlier time baseball. So we start at the bottom of the chart with this word swinging, which I have in air quotes. Now I put the air quotes around it because swinging has a certain connotation and understanding by people, in the average player's mind, that I want to highlight that that's not my definition of swinging. But and I've had one of my past mentors who had an artistic and poetic sensibility, if you will. He just wouldn't use the word swing. He just hated the word swing because to him it meant this sort of levering, ratcheting, slapping action of the arm only. And to him this was a fairly ugly way of swinging. But this is the way most recreational players and the way I started as well. So I grew up, like many of you, without any tennis lessons or instruction. I just found my way, worked my way into the game. And of course, the big thing when you're trying to establish yourself just as a basic player so that people will want to play with is that you get the ball back over the net when they hit it. And so our way of dealing with that is to try to manage this moment of contact so the racket face squares, in a certain way that the ball goes over the net and down into the other side of the court. And so this is the great challenge of the beginning tennis player, and all tennis players, but especially at the beginning. And so what's the solution that the average untutored tennis player takes is they try to keep the body still, so that takes one variable out of this, and allow the arm to come into contact with this pushing or levering action. And at the beginning, it's a very slow action because that's all that they can time up to square this racket. Otherwise, the racket's going too far up or down or something. So they just slow everything down, and that's what I did as well. The other thing they do is they minimize the racket turn back so that there's only a short distance between the contact and the take back, and that's what I did too. I had mostly a slicing kind of blocking action on my forehand. So I would only essentially take the racket back 2 or 3 inches maybe and just move this way and just try to square up the contact. And eventually got a little bit better than that, but that was the basic problem. And you see this essential problem with all recreational players is they may take the racket back here, maybe even a little bit more, but they want to keep the racket head lined up, square to the target, and sort of push through directly to the target this way. This is what makes common sense. It works at a certain lower level of tennis. And if you're satisfied with that, then you're probably watching the wrong channel because I want you to evolve. So in the evolution of technique and in the evolution of this channel, from where we first started, we started talking about how we need to incorporate a understanding that the throwing action is the underlying action below the swinging action. And there's a long history of why that is true. But so in a good throwing action, in a bad throwing action, if you go to any throwing site, and you had someone standing here facing the target like I am and wanting to throw to the target, and they threw like this, well, you would say, well, that person is arming the ball. They're just using their arm to throw the ball, and they're kind of using it as dart-like linear fashion to try to throw it. And in the old days, they used to say, well, that's like throwing like a girl. Now, we don't say those things anymore because it has nothing to do with being a girl. It's the fact that girls weren't taught to throw properly in general. Exceptions to the rule, of course. So we talked about how in a good throwing action, and all the instructors agree about this, is that it has to be a body-driven action, that we have to use the entire rotational body to drive the arm action. And if we get the body action right, the arms will take care of itself. The arm lags behind and then releases into the throw. And in general, this is how we can evolve our tennis swinging technique, where we have on the topspin, we have an underhanded sort of high throw. And I've had many do these exercises where we're doing these things, try to get you the basic feel and get the body more involved and letting this body go free and the arms swing up and behind in this spiraling action. But we'll see as we go into the other strokes that this throwing action is also important in those. On the serve, as I said, has always been in tennis much more of this high vertical throwing action. And again, we're going to use our whole body, and we're going to come up, and our body's leading the way and arms lagging, and then our arm comes up, elbow forward, and we release into contact with a pronation. Of course, we have the same thing in tennis with a swinging action and a pronating action in this topspin forehand throw. So that's why understanding these principles and feels is important, and will be important throughout the whole evolution. So the next step up in evolution of tennis players in general on a professional tour, and in our channel, where we've kind of build up higher level understandings and principles as we move up to a more sophisticated skill level, is this idea of slinging. And this is the idea that we have this action, the swinging action, coming out of the rotation of the body without a lot of conscious directional control into our arm and hand to try to do all the things that we think need to be done. Is that it's much more of a emergent action out of this rotating body, and the racket slings up, is released in a free flowing, super fast spiraling action that at the right moment will square the racket to contact, which we'll talk about more in a second. So we spent quite a few lessons talking about how do we load the body in this lowering and catapulting action and twisting and turning of the body, and letting the body lead this slinging action. And all those things can be practiced still to good effect. It's always, you know, a good feeling to incorporate that into your swinging process. So by no means are these things obsolete as we move along to higher levels. We're just incorporating the lower level principles into these higher, more sophisticated concepts. And today we're moving on to another higher level concept of swinging, which I call unfurling. And there's only a few teachers in other sports, particularly golf, that have focused on this concept and this word, but it's something that I want to share with you, and I think it does capture some essential quality of the high definition or higher level swings of the GOATs, and that, you know, gives us a clear glimpse of where we want to go with our swing. So you know what the word unfurl means is that if you have something like a flag wrapped around a pole, and then if you pull out the flag, that's unfurling the flag, right? Or if you have, maybe more appropriate, you have a sail, like a jib sail on a sailboat, and the sail is wrapped around the spar or mast, and then that sail is unfurled and spreads out, catches the wind. That's an unfurling sequence as well, and a rotational sequence as well. And that's really what we were focused on in this lesson, is this unfurling process, which captures, you know, more of the complete idea of the kinetic chain from beginning to end, all the rotational segments operating in sequence in a smooth, integrated, highly efficient manner without energy leaks. And that wave of energy that we get from our sinking into the ground and then the ground starting to push up. We get this wave of energy that moves slower at the beginning and then faster and faster as it moves up through the winding and unwinding of the body until it passes into our hitting shoulder and then down into our arm and into our hand handling the racket. And that energy flow doesn't just give us the power to sling the racket, but it also controls the path and the squaring of the racket to contact that we'll get into. And it happens pretty much on its own if we get the body and the sequencing right. And there's a sense of, as we come out of the slot, our hands, our racket are closer to our body. As we've come in from the drop and the sink into the slot, now our hand and arm are closer to our body, synced into our hips and our back. And as we turn up and out in the spiral, the arm comes out on its own. It extends and unfurls on its own through the rotating energy of our body and the centripetal force of the racket head going to the outside of the swing circle. So this is, again, we're working with the laws of physics, and we're working with the laws of physics rather than against them. So in a quick capture, that's what unfurling is about. With you, the scientific measurement of this process in several lessons, and here it is again in the background. It's called the kinematic sequence, which is just measuring the speed of the different body segments as they unwind and rotate in the kinetic chain release. Again, starting with very slow down below we're just highlighting a few elements here, like the hips might only be going 5 miles an hour in this unwinding rotation. The midsection might be going 10 miles an hour. The chest maybe 15 miles an hour, and the upper shoulders maybe 20. That speed is passed along to the swinging arm around the body. But if that's all we have, then we only have a swing that's the same speed as our arm going around our body, which is about 20 miles an hour. In all sports, golf, baseball, the highest level, the arm is only going around the body about 20 miles an hour. On the PGA Tour, where they swing much faster, the average hand speed on the driver is only 21 miles an hour. Baseball, they've measured it the same way, only 20 miles an hour. So the big difference in this kinematic sequence that you see is when we can sync up our arm motion to the body rotation and the release of energy, we can catch the wave of energy passing up through our body just right, with our arm lagging and racket lagging, and then this racket can accelerate 4 or 5 times faster than our hand, 80 or 90 miles an hour. This is the revolution of the new paradigm that the big three brought into play, and now everyone on the men's side and most of the women have adopted it. But I want to go back to my historical analogy because this will set the whole entire perspective and context for what we do in tennis. You see that Babe Ruth wasn't just a little better than past players. You know, he was on a whole nother level. He set the major league record for single season home runs at 60 home runs in 1927. That record lasted 34 years. It wasn't until Roger Maris in 1961 broke it. And again, it wasn't because Ruth was playing with a new lively ball that the older generation didn't. I have a comparison here with Ty Cobb, who was the greatest hitter prior to Babe Ruth, and still holds the record for the highest lifetime batting average in baseball. And Ty Cobb led the league in home runs with 9 home runs at one time, versus Ruth's 60 home run record. And their eras of playing overlapped, so it wasn't just because of the live ball of one generation versus the other. Ruth hit 59 home runs in 1921 when Cobb was still playing, and Ty Cobb, the greatest hitter of the previous generation, hit 1 home run. So that's the kind of difference that we're talking about. So what was the difference between Babe Ruth's swing and everybody else, including Ty Cobb? Well, Ruth's swing, and Ruth was left-handed, but I'll sort of do this right-handed. Ruth's swing was driven by the body and led by the body, which is what we're going to be talking about for the tennis swing. So the older generation of Ty Cobb, and again, he was left-handed, but he would stand at the plate with a very stiff, still body, and he'd have a split hand grips on the bat, and I'll have a link in the notes section so you can see this for yourself. And so Ty Cobb was all about just making contact with the ball, and he would use this sort of pushing action with his arms to get the barrel of the bat to make good contact, and he did. He was very successful in hitting singles and some doubles. So that was one major difference. Ruth's use of his entire body to swing, and the previous generation just using their arm in this sort of levering action. The second significant difference was, Ruth just embraced the rotational action of the swing. Not just his body rotating, but letting the bat completely go free and rotate around his body. This was contrary to the older generation of Ty Cobb, who had this very linear pushing action towards the pitcher, just trying to make contact. The third major difference was just the overall athleticism of Ruth's swing. And we see this in the evolution of almost all sports, from where they start at the beginning, where people, by being athletic, they're not using their entire kinetic chain in their whole body. And Ruth, swung out of his shoes. He loaded up everything, and then he released it in a tremendous swing. They called him the Sultan of Swat. This is very different than the stiff mechanical way of swinging of the previous generation, where the body didn't really play a part. It was still, and they were sort of just this mechanical levering action with the arms. Another major difference was basically the pulling action of the swing that Ruth had employed. After he got wound up, and then he released, his lower body went first, then his upper body, and then the bat followed in a sequence. This is quite a bit different, again, to the pushing and levering action of the previous generation. And finally, what made Ruth's swing revolutionary was taking advantage of this whip component of the swing, where the body is unwinding, lower body, upper body, and then the arms following, and then the extension and release in a whip-like manner, so much faster than the older generation that had essentially no whip component at all. It was just a pushing linear action. And before I play a video clip I obtained about Ruth's swing, I converted it to a slow motion swing so you can see all this better. Before I play that, I just want to show you sort of some of the basics of the Babe Ruth swing. And again, I'm doing this right-handed, he was left-handed. So, and we'll go through this in more detail, but there was a tremendous amount of shifting back and gathering energy in Ruth's swing, and he would lift and dip this lead leg, which so many baseball players do today, even more so. And you see this sort of shifting back and pulling back in the shoulders and arms. He's gathering up this energy. And with Ruth, after he got sort of wound up back here and coiled in, he would have this tremendous unwinding, first with the lower half, with a tremendous stride forward towards the pitcher in baseball, because it's much more linear oriented. And he would be falling and sinking in this sort of recentering move that we talked about in previous lessons in tennis. Same throwing action, swinging action, always has this sinking and lowering where the pressure is driven into the ground, some momentum and lead pressure is going into the front leg. And then, of course, he would, start to unwind from the lower half in a rotational manner, sequential manner, and then, this tremendous follow through. Now, Ruth did not have one component that modern players do, which we have talked about in tennis, which is when modern players stride forward and they brace with this side thing, then they push back and up to generate even more torque in their body, more power. And Ruth really didn't have that. You'll see it in the video that he sort of gets out here and then he just sort of kind of lunges ahead. So he's missing that piece of power that we have in the modern player, but of course he was still fantastic in what he did. Let's take a look at Ruth's swing. This is taken in batting practice towards the end of his career, not his top form, but gives you a good view of the basic sequencing and power that we're talking about. So now we're looking at the new paradigm comparison with Ruth and tennis. And I put up photos of Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe as sort of the old paradigm. And we've talked about this several times throughout the course of the series. Again, it's nothing to demean any of their accomplishments. They were great champions, the greatest in the world at that time. But they swung the racket in quite a different manner than we're talking about. And I'll have video links in the notes so you can take a look at all this for yourself. So what are the difference between the new paradigm and the old paradigm? New paradigm of the kinetic whip and the old model of the linear stiff forehand. And basically it's all the same things that we talked about, the difference between Babe Ruth and the previous generations, the same paradigm shift in tennis. So the new generation of the big three brought in a much more body-driven swing as opposed to the arm-only swing that earlier generations in tennis had and were the dominant way of swinging. They also brought in a much more rotational understanding of the body and the swing path. Again, as opposed to the Connors and McEnroe version where the body stood very stiff and there was this sort of swinging gait action of the arm. They were very good at it, but it wasn't anything really like the modern day swing. The whole idea of being more athletic and using all parts of our body to generate power and speed, something that was brought into this new paradigm. Again, as opposed to keeping the body still and just using the arm in the old paradigm. This idea in the new paradigm that we're in a pulling motion of led and driven by the body's action. These are the big muscles, the core muscles in our body. This is the main source of power we have in all sports. It would be very strange if all the power suddenly was in our arm, one of the weaker parts of our body. No, the rotational pulling action in the right form creates a pulling action on the handle of the racket that eventually is released into the swing. Whereas the older generation from beginning to end was a pushing and levering action of the arm. That's what powered the swing. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, the new generation paradigm is really taking advantage of all this idea of the whip element in the swinging process, where the racket head is going to accelerate 4 or 5 times faster because of the angular momentum created by the rotational hand path of the player. Then the racket head swings out and accelerates around the swing curve. Quite a bit different than this sort of thing where there's the hand and the racket head are going at the same speed, 20 miles an hour. To the advantage of the new paradigm swing over the old paradigm swing, the difference really is revolutionary. The old paradigm, people swang as fast as their hand could go around their body, which was only about 20 miles an hour. But with the new kinetic whip paradigm, racket head speeds are getting up to 80, 90 miles an hour, sometimes even more. So 3 to 4 times faster at least. Now, I don't want to make this basic analogy in comparison too oversimplified. We did have players who played with topspin in past eras, some great players and some great champions. So Laver comes to mind, Borg, Wielander, Lendl, Vilas, all had topspin as a big part of their game. But they just didn't have the racket head speed to produce the power and spin that we see in the new paradigm. And in the 90s, Agassi and Sampras were dominant players. And they did have a more athletic style than previous generations, which is what we would expect as we progress. And they did have some components of whip and rotational action for sure. But it wasn't as much or as athletic or as rotational or as whip-like as the big three and the new generation. It just didn't have the racket head speed to produce the power and spin on a shot of 80 miles an hour on a ground stroke and 3,000 revolutions per minute on topspin. So, to boil it all down, the new paradigm is this extraordinary combination of spin and power, spin and speed that you can get with this kinetic whip forehand. Now, a lot of recreational players just don't believe at this point that you can swing hard and still be consistent with your swinging. But with this new paradigm swing, you can have the speed and you can have the consistency as well. And that's what this lesson and most of our series has been all about. And we have talked through many of these differences throughout the series. But today I want to sort of move everything up to sort of a higher level capture of these ideas. And remember, we had to spiral up and out and various things, which are still good things to practice. But today I want to try to give you some cues that you can think about to sort of summarize all the things that we've been talking about. So I broke it into 3 different phases that I'll go over in more detail here, but it starts with a gathering of energy and a pullback and a shift of weight. And then there is a sink and separate phase that we've also talked about, but we haven't focused as much as we needed to on the idea of separation of the arms and upper torso from the lower body unwinding that we'll talk about today. And then the third stage is this unwinding and unfurling process. So the first phase, and I'll use the bat for this because we're going to go into showing Babe Ruth doing this, is this gather stage. And so I'm just using one word like I recommended before. We should think about using the word loading as a swing cue. Loading and unloading. You know, those could be our swing cue ideas to be put into effect well. Most players don't get loaded, so they can't unload. So gather is another version of loading, but it has a few other components to it that I think may be helpful for you. Is that we have the shifting of pressure and weight in our trail, hip, and area. That's part of the gather. We have a coiling of the torso in, sort of shoulder down. That's part of the gathering. We have a rotation of the front hip and the back hip into a more coiled, gathered position. And our arms and our shoulders and our hitting arm are also moving up and gathering, twisting a little bit in this gathering stage. And we can have a lifting of the lead leg in baseball, and to some degree we have this same in tennis. We'll talk about it. So first phase of this swing is a gather. And so you can use that word as you practice to try to incorporate all these different elements into this first phase of the swing. The second phase in the swing is the sink and separate, just using those two words to try to encapsulate many different individual actions that we've gone over before in detail. So from the gather stage, wait on the trail, gather it up here, then there is a unwinding. In tennis, it's more of a rotational action. There's more of a step linear in baseball, but there's a recentering and sinking of the body in this sinking phase. And in the sinking phase, there's also a side bend of the body, which tends to lower the racket or the bat back into a more position that will enable us to swing it more effectively and powerfully. So we can't swing up here. We have to get the racket or the bat sort of aligned with our shoulders and arms, that we'll talk about. So there's the sinking, the recentering, the side bend, the shift of pressure and momentum into our lead side. That's all about sinking and separating, but what we haven't talked about as much is that in this process where the body starts to extend and unwind, the arms are held back or left back and dropped deeper into the behind and onto the side of us eventually, but then brought into play. You can see with Djokovic in the next slide. So we need, in this sinking and separating, we can't keep our arms close into our body. We need to extend our hitting shoulders and arms out deeper so that the racket and the bat falls deeper behind us. So we have a lot more range of motion to swing the bat, where we can apply force in this whole swing path. If we do like most players, is just they drop the racket just to their side and contacts here, well, they can't really develop much speed like I couldn't do just in this short distance. So we need the separation phase. And not only do we need the separation of depth of our arms in position, but we need the stretch across our whole body, pelvis, stomach, chest, shoulders. So as we start this momentum into the unwinding of the hips, we can actually use this to anchor and pull back and get even more stretch in our hitting side and our hitting shoulder. And the separation between the lower body and the upper body in this movement is the chief source of power in the swing. And again, we don't see this in very many recreational swings. There's no separation. Everything moves as one piece. We want separation of these different movements and stretch between the upper and lower body, and distance with some of our arm swing created. In terms of creating this sink and separation in tennis and our evolution of our understanding, I want to play a little video that one of our viewers voluntarily sent us, said I could use it to illustrate sort of what a recreational beginner swing looks like. And what that swing looks like is, everything moving as one piece. There's no sequencing, and it's very slow, and the whole body and arms move in this circling manner. And I'm just play this for a second. You can see it for yourself. And you could say, well, that's just a really raw beginner, and he was a beginner, but he's improved since then. So I don't want you to look at it as just critically saying, oh, that's a bad swing, he's a beginner. But realize that the point that I'm trying to make about how we can't have a unitary, blocky, moving action of our body and arms, that's not sequencing. We need sink and separation. We need stretch, and we need the release of that stretch in the swing. So you may have probably have a more advanced version of this swing, no doubt. But see if you still have too much of this unitary swinging action in your swing, and whether you have any real separation between this sink and separate stage. So take a look at this. In the last phase that I've characterized as unwinding and unfurling, and I'm using the racket back now, but we'll look at Ruth, is that once we've sunk and separated, that the first stage of our movement from the slot that we went over in much detail is sort of an unwinding stage where the hips are leading the unwinding and the shoulder lays back and we're supinating the forearm and the racket is trailing behind the action, with the initial action sort of going out to the right here. So we're not turning in right away. We're not aggressively rotating right. And that's the unwinding part of this phase. And the big mistake that we've been trying to correct in our instruction is the idea that Coco Gauff was illustrating in all of her mistakes, is that she wanted to fire this hitting side and rotating side up and through right away from this phase. And this ruined her point of contact. It straightened out her body, made her horizontal swing path more horizontal instead of getting the topspin that we want. So we need to restrain this impulse to hit with our hitting side. And we need to let this unfold and unwind from the body pulling action through our hips, through our pelvis, through our chest, through our non-hitting arm. This is a pulling action, and letting that lag behind. So we've been working quite a bit on that. And we've already talked about how in phase 2 we want to create this stretch and depth and width in our forearm. And yes, this is brought in as we sink and move up and out into the swing. But we really need to get this idea of separation and racket depth so that we can have a longer swing path to accelerate this racket around. And once again, to highlight the difference between a good swing and a bad swing, I've had this little kinematic sequence in the background. This is what scientifically measured a bad swing looks like. And you would predict that it would be exactly like this. So when the hips, chest, arm, and racket are all moving just as a unitary piece, there's no sequential wave of speed increasing. Just everything moves around at the same speed, not very sequenced, a little sequenced, but not very sequenced. And all these waves look right about the same, about 20 miles an hour. And this is what we're trying to get away from. Now, in terms of the unfurling part of this last phase, I have the picture of the ballerina and ice skater behind me, which is another example of unfurling, where, and I'll have a video clip of a ice skater illustrating this, is that as an ice skater wants to increase the speed of rotation of their spin, they bring their arms close into their body and their body starts spinning very fast. Now, if they want to slow the body down, then the arms are extended out and eventually, can bring the rotation of the body to a stop. And we see the same in the ballerina, where when they're doing their rotational moves, the arms are brought into the body to increase the body's speed of rotation and then extended out to slow that rotation. So we take a look at those for a minute. In terms of unfurling in the swing, we have the same laws of physics being applied. So we have a rotating body where the arms are sort of close in, but then in the unfurling stage, just like the ballerina and the ice skater, the arms are extended out. During that process, the body is slowing down. In fact, when we get to the end unfurling stage, the hips basically have stopped unfurling or unwinding. And the chest as well is stopping and slowing down almost. And then that allows us to shoot the hitting side through at the end. That is the unfurling along with the extension of the arm that we get from the slowing down of the rotation of the body, and then the hitting arm takes over in this extension and unfurling. So the unfurling, gives us that whip-like speed throughout contact and into the follow-through. We've already talked plenty about that. But what we haven't talked as much about is, again, how this unfurling actually creates more consistency in the swing. So how is that possible? Well, as we unfurl from the slot and start this movement around the swing circle, the rotational torque of the body as it turns and pulls the handle and the arm up and around the swing circle like this, that this pulling on the handle through the body's transmitting that force in a torquing action through the arm and the hand. You don't have to consciously manipulate it, you just let it happen. That this racket head is going to be squared at the last part of our swing as we run out of, as they call it, the anatomical limit of our swing. So my arm is extending now. As I start to get to the turn of the swing, the final turn, I can't extend any further, even though a lot of teachers want you to do that. In our rotational action, that racket is going to be having to follow this arcing path. So as it comes up and our body is turning the handle in this curving path, the racket head moves up into squaring position. And it does it sort of automatically if our form is right and we're at the right distance from the ball, we haven't extended into it, that this turning action and then the final pronation of the arm and the throwing action closes the face of the racket just at the right moment in the passing of this arc. And so all this happens automatically with the right form. So our consistency of our contact and the amount of topspin that we're generating happens as a natural byproduct of our swing form. That's part of what makes this a totally different paradigm than trying to manage and control this with our arm and overmanage and micromanage it. We can let this go free if we have the right form. And I want to play another Ruth video. This is when he was at the top of his form, showing you these three phases of his swing. And you can pretty much take it from here. I don't need to talk you through this after this point, so I'll play that video. So back to tennis and the tennis paradigm. Big picture, what we're saying is that this new paradigm swing, once you learn it, makes playing tennis at a higher level so much easier. You get all the swing speed that you want, but you also get vastly more consistency and more topspin control with this swing. So that's why, we'll step through this in more detail on the swing on the tennis level. So first in the background, again, the 3 phases: the gather, the sink and unwind, or sink and separate, and then unwind and unfurl. So the first stage is this gather stage. And again, we'll start this whole process and keeping this process in a much more athletic start to begin with. Remember, we said this whole paradigm is more athletic. It's from beginning to end, it's more athletic. Even in the ready position, we're more athletic with the weight down into our legs, the hinge, the 30-degree tilt forward, and we're ready to put something more athletic into motion. And so we have the step out and the weight shifting to our back, the coil of our hips, and sometimes we see this left leg not necessarily pick up, but we see this left leg of players sort of flex in, helping us load and coil the hips properly in the gather stage. And we talked about having a more vertical coil lift of our arms, where we're spiraling up with our ribs and our chest and our muscles into this gathering higher position, as opposed to just letting our arms dangle on the side and dropping them to the side. We're coiling up vertically so that we can then extend our arm in the next phase out deep and behind us. So I said I wanted one word to sort of encapsulate many different concepts, so we're encapsulating many of the lessons with this gather idea. But there's also a key component of mental focus with the gather word. So we're really gathering our forces, gathering our energy to really put something into this swing. Now, we don't have to agree with everything Jimmy Connor said about tennis as war and wanting to sort of kill our opponent. But we are gathering our forces, gathering our energy to really deliver something forceful. We're out to win these points. We're out to win this match. We're out to dominate our opponents. So before we do that, we need to gather our forces, gather our energy. And so I don't see that mental focus with many recreational players. They're just playing along and they don't really get serious till the ball is coming across the net and landing on their side of the court. And they say, well, then I have to do something. That's a neutral, passive mentality that we need to get out of. We need to be hyper-focused on loading and gathering as we're getting ready to receive the shot from their opponent. And we need to move much faster in this loading and gathering, as we've talked about. So we really want to deliver something powerful back at that opponent. So we have to gather first. So once we've gathered, we're going to sink and separate, and we don't need to go into that much detail because we've gone over this many times. So there's the sinking, lowering of pressure into our legs and hips. There is the recentering from having the weight shifted back here to being recentered torso more over our middle of our hips, with some pressure going into the front side with a bump. And we need a side bend, which helps us create that pressure. And we need the extension and separation. As our hips start to unwind, we get this stretch across our whole body. Again, that missing piece of separation that we're now talking about, that needs to be incorporated into your practice and into your swing. And then the final phase of unwinding and unfurling. So once we've got the sink and separation going and we're starting from the slot, then we're going to resist the impulse to overexert and overuse our hitting side and immediately start rotating aggressively, pronating our arm aggressively. All those things, we're resisting that. We're letting this process unwind. We're slowing it down in a sense. We're letting the body pull this arm, with the arm lagging, the racket head trailing the hand, not overtaking it right away, which is what most people do. Allowing this momentum to build out to the right initially. And we're gonna then get to the turn of the swing where our body is pivoting more towards the target, starting to slow down, if not stop down. Same with the chest, is starting to slow down and stop. And now this whole energy is wave-like passing into the arm in the unfurling stage and extension stage. And we're allowing this rotational swing to be this curved hand path around the body so that the racket at the right moment is going to square into contact and then continue. And again, to highlight the consistency element of this new paradigm, we're allowing the unfurling process to square the racket. And it's exactly the same process we have when we have an overhand throwing motion, baseball or football. So we have the rotational action of the body driving the arm. We're not arming the ball, we're letting the body drive the throw, and the elbow comes up and forward in the baseball throw. Chest is forward, but now it's stopped rotating, and now the arm is extending to reach its anatomical limit and release the ball, and then the hand pronates over in the release. It's exactly the same thing in football. And then we also have it more clearly illustrated to people in the serve, is that we're going to come up, let the body turn and rotate and swing up the racket, coming up on edge, elbow extension, and then as we reach our limit of our hand reach and the throwing motion, the forearm and the hand pronate over, and we end up with the server ending up in this position. It's just the natural result of this throwing action. It's harder to see in the topspin forehand and backhand because we're in an underhanded throwing action. But if you, now that you have that clearer in your mind, and you can see how as I reach this stage in the swing, how naturally the hand and the release is going to pronate and carry through like this. And we don't have to manage it, it happens on its own. It's just harder to see in the topspin forehand and backhand, but it's the same release process that will automatically square the racket that we need to make the directional control of the ball to the target, but our arm will continue on this arcing path without any interruption and without any redirection or extension out to the target that so many people are advocating incorrectly. We essentially want a curving hand path because we have a curving arcing swing path. This is the correct motion of the swing path, this arcing hand and racket path, not this path. This path is only going to slow down the swing. The racket head will come at the same speed through contact. It will disrupt the point of contact. The head will tend to flip and scoop around on you, whereas this is held back at the last moment, and then only in the process of hitting is the ball squared to the target and then released to the target, and the hand continues. And the squaring to contact process as a result of the unfurling happens in golf as well. And I have this background quote and picture of Ben Hogan, who's known to be one of the greatest ball strikers of all time. And you can see his quote here. He had a beautiful flowing sequential rotational action on his swing, and I'll have a clip in the notes for you to look at. You don't need to know anything about golf or care about golf. I just want you to look at how this sequencing and flowing action of the body is then transmitted to this trailing club head, and how that's whipped through. And you can see the quote by Ben Hogan is that he never worried about the squaring of contact, even though in golf they're swinging the club twice as fast on average as the tennis player, and their time with the ball is 1/10 of the time that we have with the ball. But even with that, he didn't have to worry about hitting the ball straight, because he would just let this unfurling happen in its proper sequential way and squaring with, and just to try to cement these ideas even further, I have yet another view of Djokovic executing this from the rear with the hand and the racket tracers turned on, so you can see for yourself about this curving hand path and the curving racket path. And you can see in this first slide, we're just starting out of the slot, and the symmetry of the curve starts right from the beginning. So we're driving out to the right, and the racket head is trailing behind. In this first phase, we talked about it, the unwinding part where we're not overexerting and coming around too quickly. And then as we move along up into contact in the unfurling, first stage of the unfurling, the body rotation has stopped, and now the hitting arm and extending and unfurling through contact, squaring to contact momentarily in this path. And then as we move further along in Djokovic's path, swing path and hand path, you see the curve of the hand path and the curve of the racket around the body. And now, because the racket head was lagging the hand at contact, but as we pass through and accelerate, this head has started to swing around and has actually passed his hand a few fractions of a second afterwards. And we always see the same sequence in all the great swings of the modern day. So we're not seeing anything that looks like this, like the swinging gate action and the follow through. We're seeing the racket on edge at the sort of 45-ish angle, because that's how we pass through contact. We see the racket head accelerating, and then as the body starts to relax and the arm extends, we see even further extension out here to this stage. And then finally, when the body finally relaxes, the arm comes back and down. So this last slide sort of captures the summary of many of our points, is that you can see at the finish of Djokovic's stroke the whole path, the hand path, the racket head path, in this great circling, rotational, spiraling form. The racket path matching the hand path naturally, because that's where the racket is attached to our body. And you can see that it's completely rotational from beginning to end, and that the squaring will happen on its own. You don't have to steer and direct. There's no linear redirection of the racket head toward the target in the process that so many teachers talk about. They get somewhat of the rotational take back, right? But then, as they say, and this is the most critical phase of the whole stroke, as they get into the contact zone, they'll start talking about the hand going towards the target or the racket, or the handle going towards the target, and that you should consciously extend in that manner. And that's completely wrong in the new paradigm. Is we want to continue with this curving path, but we want to do it in this sequential, rotational manner. That will take care of our consistency and contact issues. So before I play a Djokovic video of the three phases we've been talking about, and then show you the other two of the big three, Federer and Nadal, their swings with the tracing on from the front angle, you'll see the same exact thing that we saw from the rear angle of Djokovic. The same curving hand path of the hand matched by the curving racket path of the racket head. And so, there's a lot of detail here, but what you need to take away from all this is that this new paradigm is what we'll be talking about in other strokes. A lot of the principles and ideas will be very similar or the same. Of course, there's always technique differences, but in terms of what you're going to get out of the channel, I hope you're going to get a new paradigm swing on all your strokes. And so this is going to be a much more athletic movement, a much more rotational and spiraling movement, a much more free movement. That's why I said at some point that learning this may change your life, is because in our everyday life and the way we grew up, we always think we have to manage and control things. And that means remaining still and over micromanaging the process, when what we need is exactly the opposite. We need to build our form so we don't have to micromanage and slow things down. We can release the club, this racket head, in all of our strokes, backhand, forehand, serve. We're going to be releasing, and we're going to use our entire body and our whole athleticism. And that's really what the future of Go tennis is all about. But now I'll pause and let you see these videos. We're now in the deliberate practice section, the how-to section of our lesson. And as usual, I want to read the precautions about injury prevention and having you take that seriously. So don't want you to do these exercises if you have any injury or physical handicap at all. Stop these exercises immediately if you feel any pain or discomfort. Do all the exercises correctly in athletic posture. We want to be twisting and rotating parts that shouldn't be twisted and rotated. And start the exercise slowly. Check them out. See if you're sore the next day before you do ramp up the speed acceleration component. So in this summation lesson, we've been focused on these three phases of the swing at a high level: the gather, the sink and separate, and the unwind and unfurl phases. And so that's what we'll deliberately practice today. So again, we're gonna leave behind some of the smaller technical issues as we go through these exercises. I want you to focus on the big picture in terms of, am I really getting and executing a basic idea of what a gather is, or a sink and separate. And maybe you'll think of a missing piece or two as we go through this, but I don't want you to get down into the weeds with this. We want to see if we can actually do these three phases in our swing: gather, sink and separate, and unwind and unfurl. So in this first exercise, as we usually do, well, we'll start with a racket this time. Sometimes we don't start with that, but I want you to do the gather, 10 reps of gather in slow motion. So we're starting from the ready position, and if you remember some of our past videos, I listed all the major principles of our swing. And so in terms of where you're going with deliberate practice, each day I go out, I think of, am I really getting deep enough in my athletic posture? Is there something really missing there? And, quite often there is. And, when I correct it, I say, aha, that makes me feel a lot better. Have I really coiled it and separated as much as I should be doing? And usually I haven't. So it's sort of a checklist for you to focus on each practice. Today we're focusing on this gather phase, and we've had it a number of lower level versions of this, of course. So I'm not going to go through all of that detail. I really need to focus on the big concept of, you know, we're really gathering our force, we're shifting our weight into our back, we're coiling and twisting up, getting our hands high, and our ribs and our torso are starting to twist and separate from the lower half. So we just don't want to turn like unitary turn. We want to turn that has a stretch already starting to build into it that we're going to deepen as we go along. So I want you to do 10 slow motion reps of the gather, pausing each time, seeing if you can do it a little bit better, but keeping to the big picture. So I'll pause the video. So this is now I want you to do 10 medium speed reps of the gather phase. And so the first set of exercises was just getting the basic movements and feels and going through it very slowly. And this next sequence in the medium speed, we're thinking about more the sequencing and segmentation and smoothness of the action. So I want you to think about all the different pieces a little bit as you go back and make this smooth and make it a true gathering of energy, like you're going to really deliver some force. So the intent has to be there from the ready position. I'm going to gather and I'm going to about to do some damage. So 10 slow motion or 10 medium speed reps of the gather phase. I'll pause. Now I want you to do this last set of 10 of the gather at match speed. And I say match speed because I want you to be in the mentality of playing a match where we can't be thinking about technique and details of our stroke. We're just thinking about the intent and execution. So we're thinking with clarity that from the ready position that we're going to gather very quickly. And our intent is to really put some energy into it quickly so that we can play this point effectively. So we have to have the movement map not only in our mind, but the intent of the movement clearly in our mind in match play settings. So I want you to work on that as well as doing the physical gather exercise. So I'll pause for 10 match speed reps of the gather phase. Pause. Now we're working on the second phase, the sink and separate phase. And so I want you to give a little thought to the idea that most recreational players, beginning players, think very much in along flat horizontal lines. They see flat straight lines ahead of them. They want to move their body in flat horizontal lines, very linear. And to move to a higher level stroke, we need to change all that. So that's why the sinking, the whole idea of sinking is beyond a lot of players, because they're so used to just moving along on earth in this flat horizontal merry-go-round horizontal swing. So the whole idea of sinking and turning, getting out of that linear mentality is quite foreign, and it feels foreign at the beginning. Hopefully you've been practicing and it doesn't feel as foreign. But so this is really a dramatic pressure shift and sinking and power gathering move with the sink. And we're going to add the side bend so that will drop into the slot. And as we drop into the slot and transfer our momentum to our front side a little bit, recenter, we're going to extend out this arm much more than we've ever have, so that we really get this start of this separation, this pullback of the hitting side versus the start of the unwinding of the lead side in the hip. So that stretch happens in our pelvis, stomach, chest, all the way through our hitting arm. It's an extra pullback, extra distance that we're going to drop the racket so that we have a long path to accelerate that racket from. So I'm going to pause for 10 slow motion reps of the sink and separate phase. Now I want you to do 10 medium speeds reps of sink and separate. And before you start, I want you to think back to what you just did. Did it seem like you missed any sort of major piece of this movement? And did you really get a sink? Did you really get that separation and stretch in your body? And make sure in this medium speed that whatever was missing, you try to bring it into play, okay? So 10 medium speed of sink and separate. I'll pause. And last in the sequence for the sink and separate is the match level speed and execution mentality. So we're leaving aside all the conscious thinking, just focusing on intent and clarity of movement, of sinking and separating, and speeding that up so we're at match speed when we're doing it. You can start from the ready position and you can do the whole swing, but really focus on the second phase of sinking and separating. I'll pause the video for 10 fast reps, match level reps. Now we're going to practice the last phase, the unwinding and unfurling. And so we can start from the ready position, do 10 slow motion reps, but I want you to really be clear in your mind as we come out of the slot, as we've discussed in many lessons. We're going to do probably the opposite of what you've done most of your life, which is fire the right side, the hitting side around through as much as you can. Worried about getting the racket in contact and timed up enough. Don't worry about it. Your racket speed is going to be way faster with this new paradigm. So we have to give ourselves the space and the time to build momentum in the swing. This unwinding is the first phase of that. And we'll talk about the unfurling part in a second, but in this first slow motion exercise, I want you to feel this unwinding as your principal feel, and we'll get to the unfurling in a moment. We'll pause. Now we'll go to 10 medium speed reps of the unwind and unfurl. And so before we start, I want you to think if you really could feel this unwinding of the body ahead of the arm lagging. And if you didn't, I want you to try to bring that feeling more into play in this medium speed version. But I also want you to feel the pulling, rotating of the body powering the shot, not the right side and the arm swinging around. I want it to be a pulling action, and as the body rotates medium speed, the arm is going to extend and release and unfurl on its own. And those are the two feelings I want you to focus on. 10 medium speed reps. I'll pause. Now this last set is, of course, the match speed level of the whole swing, from the ready position, the gather, the sink, the separate, the unwind, and then the unfurl. And so we're moving our body in a overall rotational manner, much more than maybe you ever have, and you're pulling with your non-hitting side, your hip, your hand, your non-hitting hand. They're all pulling and then stopping and then rotating, stopping this rotation so that our hitting side can fling out, sling out, and unfurl. And we're going to be having this sort of sinking and dipping, spiraling action going as well. This is going to help us with our swing path to make it perfect for contact. So we're not going to be swinging in a flat horizontal plane anymore. We're going to be sinking and spiraling in a rotational manner, letting the racket lag and then unfurl on its own. I'll pause the video. Now, like we usually do, I want you to take these exercises out to the court to start hitting balls, even though we're not on a court. So the first 10 balls or so, you can make it 20 if you like, would be medium speed topspin forehand shots, where you're just focusing on these 3 phases. And we're still being a little bit more self-conscious about what we're doing, and if we're missing any pieces in these medium speed hits. I don't want your partner just to throw it out to your forehand side, so you take just a half a step or step. Don't want movement to be adding complexity to this at this point. And, see if you can let this go at medium speed, sinking and rising, spiraling, effortless lagging of the racket and acceleration at the end. We don't care if the ball particularly is getting hit in the net or goes out long. It's the quality of the hitting that we're focused on in this exercise. Once you do that at medium speed, then I want you to hit 10 or 20 balls really at match level execution with kind of a new energy and purpose and intent in your physical being and in your mental state about what you're doing. You have a much clearer idea of what you need to do and what you should do. So that's what you need to do, these reps with that focus. After that, you can, with your partner or without, you can start to add more complexity and movement to these exercises in a deliberate way. Sometimes you want to have be pushed back, sometimes come in, sometimes a run around. You can have all kinds of variations. It's up to your creativity to what you think you should be working on. So I'll pause the video now for these on-court exercises. So we're at the end or near the end of our topspin forehand series. There'll still be other things rolled out over time, even some quick tips, believe it or not. It might even take only a minute to watch them instead of 45 minutes. But before we depart on today's lesson, I want you to remind you of what our sort of start of our lessons were all about. I said Go Tennis was about trying to let you fulfill your potential as an athlete and a tennis player. And I say those as 2 different things because I really, as I told you, most of my tennis career really wasn't fulfilling myself as an athlete. I was playing at a much lower level than I should have been playing had I really applied the kind of learning that we're applying. So it took me a long time to decide that good enough wasn't. And once I made the changeover and really started to pursue my potential, I was a lot happier with my game and myself, and I think over the long run you will be too. But I can't be critical if you're not there yet. I just encourage you to think about these things. So we get better by a better movement map, better principles, and better feels, and that's what I hope we've delivered in this series. I appreciate, again, some of the generous words and comments that have been posted and sent to me by email. Very much appreciate it. Thank you. So I think in this series, I have delivered, a better movement map for you for this topspin forehand, along with a lot of new principles and feels that over time that you can gradually master and understand at a deeper level. We never get to the ultimate level of understanding and skill. There's always more levels. They say in black belt, for example, is just the first level of black belt in martial arts. It just means that you're sort of qualified to study at a higher level, and it goes up to 10 levels of black belt beyond that. So we're never ever get to the top of the mountain. We're always students in this process. I do want to say I appreciate all of those of you who have taken the time and energy to see these videos, and particularly for those who have actually gone out and practiced a lot of these things. I just want to encourage you to continue on your journey. And for those who maybe still are sitting on the sidelines a little, I encourage you to think about getting off the sidelines and doing them a little bit more to fulfill your potential as an athlete and a tennis player. So there's a ton of detail in these videos, and I think it's important at the end to say what I've said before, which is, we really have to keep our eyes on the prize of what we're trying to accomplish and who we're trying to be. There are going to be challenges along the way, for sure. But since we have used Babe Ruth as our analogy, one of the greatest athletes and players of all time, I'll leave you what he said, is that he said, every strike brings me closer to the next home run. And I hope the same is true for you.